Hello, I'm Larry Blank, and this is From the Pit number 10. I thought I'd continue from where I was speaking about last time on my podcast. I was talking about my career and being mentored, and I want to continue on that note, but I want to talk a little bit more about uh, orchestrating. This may be a little bit technical for some people at times, but why not? Let's talk about working with orchestrators as both a student and as a music director for shows. I talked about how I was doing the show Copperfield, and Irv Kostal took me under his wing. And when I finally moved to California, he took me as a student, basically, and uh, was a surrogate father to me as well, and really took me under his wing and taught me a lot of stuff. But earlier than that, I had always been interested in orchestration, which of course led to my conducting career. And I was always dealing with orchestrators. But going back to my first big show as the original music director, the conductor was They're Playing Our Song. And I was so excited that the orchestrators that Marvin Hamlish hired were Ralph Burns, Richard Hazard, Dick Hazard, and Gene Page. Gene Page was a famous disco writer and been writing a lot of hit records. Dick Hazard was a Hollywood orchestrator for many, many years, did many, many recordings, many films, worked with Marvin all the time. And Ralph Burns, of course, was a famous big band writer going back to the Woody Herman band and did many, many Broadway shows, Sweet Charity, among them Pippin, of course. And then he ultimately won an Academy Award for, I believe, Cabaret and for All That Jazz. Uh, Quite a talented man, and I was really thrilled to be working with him. So I knew quite a bit about orchestration, but only as a conductor and as an avid student and caring about how it sounded on Broadway. But at this point, I was working almost exclusively as a conductor for Broadway shows. So when Ralph came in and Marvin decided that Ralph would do the bulk of the show, Dick would do some ballads, and Gene Page would do a couple of the numbers which were kind of disco based. Um, so it was interesting to me, and I was so glad to be talking to Ralph because I knew of his background, and he was a charming man and befriended me. And he was very clear saying that to continue your career, you have to befriend young talent, which I was. I would say he was in his late 50s at that time and had already had a very big and illustrious career. Gave me a lot of advice. But Marvin decided that the orchestra was going to be a studio orchestra rather than uh, a typical Broadway orchestra, meaning there were going to be two guitars in the pit, two keyboards in the pit, only three woodwinds, and I was used to having four or five, so I knew right away this wasn't going to be a big band show. And we were going to have two trumpets and two French horns and a string section with a harp and percussion. I thought it was really peculiar to have two trumpets and two French horns because it was unfamiliar to me for Broadway. 'Cause usually there were trumpets and trombones and maybe some horns. And I knew this was a pop score, but it was Marvin Hamlish. He knew what he was talking about. So anyway, the first arrangement that Ralph was assigned to do was a song called Fallen, which is the first song that Robert Klein sang in the show in character while he was playing the piano. And it was a very small number. I knew the strings would come in, play a little bit of something, and fade out again before the next number in the show, which was a big showstopper called Working It Out. So Ralph writes the chart, I get it, and I look it over, and I'm really fascinated to see what he did and made so much out of such a little ballad. Uh, Everything was carefully notated. The guitar parts were very carefully written for two guitars. And I noticed like halfway through the strings came in with a little thumb pad hanging along and then faded out and it continued and out on piano. I said, very interesting. And I noticed that the French horns were padding along at one point. Then all of a sudden my phone rang and Ralph was confiding in me as the music director on the show and his comrade in arms working on a musical and said, I think the French horns are a terrible idea. And he said, I think it should be a couple of trombones and forget the French horns. And I'm going, Mon Dieu, what should I do now? Except call Marvin and discuss it with him. He said, don't worry, I'll call Marvin. And Ralph said to me, the reason we want to use trombones instead of French horns is the trombones, in his words, are the balls of the orchestra. He said, without them, the orchestra has no balls. His words. So he called up Marvin, told him. Marvin didn't even flinch. We got rid of the French horns, and we now had two balls, which is really useful for the sound of the show. And you never miss the French horns. Anything that the French horns might have done, the trombones were doing, not as gracefully perhaps, but it wasn't really necessary. We needed more strength in the orchestra for the little bit of dance numbers and a little bit of excitement we needed from the pit. So two trumpets and two trombones can make quite a bit of noise, and it was a big lesson for me. Same thing with Gene Page and Dick Hazard. They had no problem at all. They wrote for whatever combination there was. And what really amazed me is you give Dick a ballad to do. And I remember the song was If He Really Knew Me, big first ballad in the show between the two leads. They each sing a chorus. And according to the technique of the time, which was for recording, you wrote the chorus for the boy, and then you wrote the chorus for the girl, or vice versa. You just changed the key and asked the copyist to copy it in the other key. So Dick Hazard, being a record writer and not a theatrical writer, didn't write too much theatrics in the arrangement. It was beautiful and sounded absolutely luscious at the orchestra rehearsals and in the pit, but it was very bland on paper. And I said something to Dick, and he very simply wrote a counterline for the second chorus in the strings, and it was absolutely beautiful. And that lifted the whole number up. But what really surprised me is he would sit there and write four-part harmony for the brass, two trumpets and two trombones, which was against everything I was taught as a conductor for theater writing. But they were playing softly and very nicely. And then on the next chorus, he would have the strings do it, the same exact notes. It was beautiful. It was very smart, very clever writing. I learned a big lesson that way. Four-part harmony sounds good everywhere. If strings play four-part harmony, it's nice. If the woodwinds do it, the brass do it. You have to have enough instruments, of course. So we only had three woodwinds. So the three woodwinds were playing flutes and saxophones and whatever they needed to do to color the orchestration. But it was a good lesson to me. And what also happened was on the song Right, for those of you that are familiar with playing our song, Ralph wrote a really good arrangement. And Marvin, after hearing it at the orchestra rehearsal, said to Ralph, can you do something else? It's just not exciting enough. And the next day, Ralph came in with the same routine, with a totally different orchestration, which is the one that remained and was recorded. And I said, how do you do that? And he said, it's just part of the job. If you're asked to do it another way, you just figure out another way. And Marvin was a smart guy, and he knew that guys like Ralph Burns and Billy Byers and Dick Hazard and Gene Page, the orchestrators he would use, were very creative. And of course, he used many other great orchestrators for his films, Jack Hayes and Herb Spencer, so many really, really talented people in the industry. But I'm talking about my experiences mostly with the guys I worked with in theater. Gene Page also was used to writing this disco stuff, and he did what he always did, and it sounded great. Dick Hazard was also uh, quite amazing in his skills for writing ballads, especially, and very simple tunes. But Marvin gave him the ballads to do and gave Ralph all the theatrical stuff and Gene the two disco numbers. But Ralph was the main guy on the show and did the overture and the entr'acte, which he split with Dick Hazard. As a matter of fact, in the um, entr'acte, which was really our big overture, there was a big piano solo in the middle. And Marvin said, no, 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 no piano solo. He said, make that a trumpet solo. And he just rewrote it and said, let's hire the guy who played Gypsy and Funny Girl when we get to New York. And we did. We hired Dick Perry as the trumpet player in New York. But when we did the show in Los Angeles, my buddy and favorite trumpet player, Richard Hurwitz, played the lead. And he was playing trumpet on the cast recording, which was recorded in Los Angeles. So we never did record a cast album with the New York orchestra, but there are tapes abounding on YouTube. And Dick Perry was a marvelous, marvelous trumpet player too. So I was blessed to have both of them. And my dealings with the orchestrators on playing our song was very simple because they certainly knew what they were doing. And if I had any questions, I would just ring them up and say, can you adjust this if something was too loud or too soft? If it was something I couldn't fix on the stand by simply, asking sections to play softer or louder, sometimes it had to be rewritten. Very occasionally, something is written for the brass and it's too loud for what's happening on stage, even with mutes in. And also, people seem to think that putting mutes in makes it softer. Well, it might, but really putting mutes on changes the color of the sound more than the volume. Sometimes it affects both, but that's just a little technical thing. And sometimes a singer would need more melody in the orchestra. Sometimes they don't. Depends what's going on. There was one song in the show, and this is a big secret in show business, but there's a song called I Still Believe in Love in the second act of playing our song. And Marvin did something which is a little sneaky. He gave the same assignment to both Dick Hazard and to Ralph Burns to do the same song and advised me not to invite either one of them to the orchestra rehearsal so they wouldn't find out what he did. We played both arrangements. Ralph's arrangement was spectacular, very much on the order of the Music That Makes Me Dance that he did in Funny Girl. Fantastic arrangement. And Dick Hazard wrote a chart which was absolutely beautiful, more like a record date, a recording session for a pop song. And that is the one that Marvin insisted we use. And that is the one that was finally recorded. And I'm so sad to say that I never saved Ralph's original arrangement and haven't been able to locate it even to look at. I wish I had the score somewhere because it was a magnificent arrangement and lost to the ages. I can't even locate it with a copyist. Sad to say. After playing our song, I went to LA to do Evita as conductor. Evita had already been orchestrated by Hershey Kay and had been running on Broadway, but the music director in New York, Rene Wiegert, had fixed some of the orchestration. He added another woodwind, which was oboe and English horn, which was not in Hershey's arrangement, and he also added, I believe, a third cello, which was very useful. Otherwise, we used Hershey's arrangements, which also had two keyboards in the pit, also two guitars in the pit, which was very popular at the time because of just the period in the late 70s, early 80s. They were doing a lot of recording sessions, and that was a very popular combination. So we were low on woodwinds, low on brass, full of strings, and a big rhythm section. And that was the pop sound of Broadway was slowly changing on the more contemporary stuff. The older shows and the older style shows had the typical orchestration of 4 or 5 woodwinds, 5 to 6 or 7 brass, and the string section. But the poppier shows had 2 keyboards, 2 guitars, which was what people were getting used to listening to the radio. So on Evita, it was what it was. The orchestra was marvelous. I did it in Los Angeles at the Schubert Theater. I had a very good orchestra. At which point, I went back to New York to conduct a show called Onward Victoria, which I might have mentioned in an earlier podcast. The score was by Keith Herman, who was a really talented composer. And it was quite an eclectic score. It was about Victoria Woodhull, who ran for president in 1865 against Ulysses Grant. I, of course, wondered why they were doing a musical about the person who lost, but she was an interesting woman, and she was a suffragette, and she was running on a platform of women as a suffragette for women to vote, and on a platform of free love and all sorts of exciting things that make for musical theater. Sad to say, the lyrics in the book weren't quite up to snuff, and the show wasn't going to have a monumental run. Keith had asked Larry Fallon to be the orchestrator. Larry was not a particularly experienced theater writer, but he worked a lot for Cy Coleman on recording sessions and was credited as the orchestrator for Seesaw. And Keith hired him on that basis. However, it turns out that most of Larry Fallon's work on Seesaw was replaced by Larry Wilcox and Jonathan Tunick. Keith didn't know that. I did. And Larry Fallon was a very capable writer, but not necessarily for theater. So at our first meeting, Keith, me, and Larry Fallon, I asked him what his plans were for the orchestra because it was such an eclectic score. And he started telling me he wanted to use saxophones and a big brass section. And I said, well, the show takes place in 1865, and there's a lot of songs. It's not necessarily dance numbers. And I said, why are you using saxophones for 1865? And he said, that's why I'm the arranger and you're the conductor. At which point I simply said, not anymore. And I told Keith that this wasn't going to work because I wasn't going to get hooked up with someone, number one, who spoke to me with that attitude and had what I thought was the wrong approach to the show. So on agreement, we decided to get somebody else, and I recommended Michael Gibson. Michael, of course, became a very successful orchestrator and did quite a few really great shows and great work for Kander and Ed, and sadly died prematurely. But Michael had already done Grease and Over Here and had worked on pre-Broadway tryout of OK and some other shows. He was quite capable. And I was good friends with him, and I wanted to give him a boost by getting him another big show. He did quite a capable job on the show. Surprising, on one number, he asked me if I would mind if he used saxophones, which we played at the rehearsal, and I quickly suggested we change it to clarinets, which we did because whatever I knew about orchestration, I knew that it wasn't going to work for a show in 1865. It just seemed like we had stepped into the wrong time zone. Anyway, Onward Victoria came and went. It was an interesting score. It went away. The show wasn't very good. In the meantime, I had been engaged to conduct Copperfield. This came on a recommendation from Don Johnston, who was the dance arranger on Onward Victoria and also the dance arranger on Copperfield. He recommended me to Rob Isco, the director choreographer. And Don Pippin had been offered the job. And as Don was always my guru and rabbi in that way, he turned the show down and recommended me. So his recommendation was enough to get me any job, and they hired me for Copperfield. I was excited to find out that the orchestrator was going to be Irwin Kostal. Irv was very, very well respected because he had done West Side Story, Forum, Fiorello, which was the first Broadway show I saw, so I knew who he was. And he was also the music director for the Gary Moore show, and every week was doing these medleys called Those Wonderful Years, which were fabulous and must-see TV in those days. Of course, he had also won an Academy Award for doing the orchestrations for the films of Sound of Music and Mary Poppins. He didn't win for Mary Poppins, West Side Story. And of course, he was the music director for Mary Poppins and many other Disney films, among others. The composer lyricist for Copperfield was Al Kasha and Joel Hirshhorn. Joel was really the composer, Al was the lyricist, but they both took credit for it. And they, of course, had worked with Irv before, and he had done the arrangement for their song Candles on the Water, and they had won Academy Awards for the theme song from The Towering Inferno, which I think was called We May Never Love Like This Again. They were nice guys, and they had written the score to Copperfield, which was a bit derivative, sounding a little bit like Mary Poppins and a little bit like Oliver and a little bit like this, a little bit like that. But with Irv there, I was confident it would become very interesting, and it did. Irv was an amazingly talented guy and was willing to share information with me, and I would pick his brain about Broadway musicals that he had done and ghosted on in the 50s. And he told me so many interesting stories. And basically was very pragmatic. And as I mentioned, he did take me on as kind of a student after that point. But working on the show, uh, there was one example where Don Johnston had written this big ballet in the first half where little David Copperfield runs away. This is the Dickens Copperfield, not the magician. Runs away from his keepers and goes forth. Uh, and it was a big ballet that Don Johnson had written, and it was lots and lots of bars and music. And Irv orchestrated it brilliantly. But in the middle of it, there were extra, literally 100 bars. And Don Johnston came to me and said, "Where did Irv come up with this? I didn't write this. What's he thinking?" So I went to Irv and said, "Irv, what is this?" And he said, "When you get to the tryout town, which was going to be St. Louis in this case, the scenery isn't going to work. And you're going to need this extra 100 bars while the scenery is working." And I laughed. He said, "You'll find out." Well, it turned out he had written up to a certain bar, which was Don's music, and then he inserted 100 bars of his own, which, if you eliminated, Don's music was totally intact. And all I can say was that Irv was 100% correct. None of the scenery worked in St. Louis. We needed every bit of these 100 bars. And when we got to New York to the amphitheater, which is now the August Wilson Theater, we eliminated the 100 bars and we went back to Don's original dance music. But Don was aghast that the orchestrator had written all this additional music. There was another arrangement that Irv wrote, which made a simple little trio number fantastic. And Al Kasher complained that the orchestration was so good that the counter line was better than the melody and stopped you from hearing the lyric. And something Irv always used to say to me was, "Don't write a counter melody better than the tune." But there, he had done that. So they asked him to rewrite the orchestration. And he did, and it wasn't quite as interesting or as exciting as his original arrangement, but it was different. And I said to her, "Why did you do that?" And he said, "What difference does it make?" He said, "It's most important that we accommodate the composer and lyricist and the show. And I can live without my brilliant counterline for 8 bars." It's a good lesson to learn because what you are doing as an orchestrator and as a conductor on a musical is accommodating the material and the show, not your own needs to be creative. So that was a good early lesson for me. And Irv was so brilliant, he could actually write a flute part to the end of the page and then write the oboe part backwards. It was a parlor trick, and I was astounded that he could do it. But he told me that once he formulated in his head what he was going to do, it was just a printout. And in his case, it really was. He was quite brilliant, and it was difficult to uh, follow in his footsteps in any way because there was nobody else who could do what he could do. There were a lot of very talented guys, but wow, he was fast and so creative and had so many ideas. He had studied so much music on his own that he had a giant bag of tricks to go to. And it was something he taught me early on, to have that bag of tricks and to try to figure out the many ways out of the little traps that develop when you're working on a musical, either as the conductor or the orchestrator. And what happened on Copperfield, there was a big dance sequence, as I mentioned earlier, that ended up in the workhouse where little David Copperfield had to go to work. And there was very little music written by Al and Joel. And it was my job as music director and vocal arranger to create something. So I created all these different counter lines and actually created my own lyrics, but they were basically uh, variations on the lyrics written by Alan Joel, so they didn't mind. It was just choral background for a transition. But it was that creative part that made Irv show an interest in me, because he said it's creative stuff like that that makes you a good arranger, and that's why he took an interest in me, as well as he was a great admirer of my conducting, which really flattered me. And but that goes back to mentoring, and it was quite wonderful to have him behind me, especially when I had someone to ring up on the phone and ask almost any question about music, especially theater music. After Copperfield, which had a brief run on Broadway, I was studying more and more with Irv about orchestration, which I really wanted to do. And I was offered another show, Colette. Colette was by Harvey Schmidt and Tom Jones. Another job I got solely on the recommendation of Don Pippin, who ran into Harvey on the street. Don had conducted 110 in the Shade for Harvey, and Harvey asked him if he wanted to conduct the show. Don said, "I'm not available, but why don't you call this guy I work with, Larry?" And I went for a meeting. And by the time I got back to my apartment at that time on West 86th Street in New York, my phone rang, and it was Harvey and Tom asking me if I would do them the honor of being music director for their show. Wow, that was pretty flattering. They told me that they were going to hire Larry Wilcox to do the orchestration. I was also thrilled to hear this. Larry was a wonderful orchestrator who had ghosted many, many shows for Ralph Burns. He was kind of an unknown talent, known in the business, but because he had been ghosting so much, his name wasn't often on the billboards. But we should all know that Larry was originally hired as the orchestrator for Chorus Line by Marvin Hamlish, but because Larry and Ralph shared some problems with alcohol, it interfered with his completing the show. By the time we did Colette, that was long resolved, but he made no bones about it, and Ralph didn't either. And the running gag, which I've heard from many arrangers, including Billy Byers, was they put a bottle of vodka on the table, and when the bottle was empty, the arrangement was finished. To explain that, orchestrating is a very lonely business. You're by yourself when you're writing. And basically, you stay up all night writing an arrangement to make a deadline the next day. And it's a bad habit to get into, but a lot of them would pour a drink and sit there and keep writing. But those guys were unbelievably fast. Larry Wilcox was a brilliant writer, could write in any style. And he was very slow. And what happened on that show, we were out of town in Seattle trying out. And Larry asked if I could help out, perhaps write some of the scene change transitions, orchestrate them. And I was happy to do that because it would be under his eye. And all I had to do was basically imitate what he had written and put the melody somewhere. So it was an easy job, and it was giving me an opportunity to orchestrate. And I did quite a bit of work on that level. He also called Jim Tyler in to orchestrate a few pieces. Jim Tyler was another unsung hero in Broadway orchestration, had ghosted for Ralph and many others, on Don Walker especially, on many, many shows. For instance, Jim Tyler did the entire To Life dance in the original Fiddler, and several of the dance numbers in Cabaret for Don Walker. So Jim was another writer that I eventually worked with on the show Teddy and Alice some years later. Very skillful guy, and would come up with stuff that just played. You put it out there, and the orchestra sounded great. Everybody was very comfortable playing, and amazing talent. A few things that I learned along the way. There's a tendency in the old style arrangements from the Rodgers and Hammerstein shows, Lerner and Lowe shows, Jerome Kern shows, Irving Berlin. There's a lot of melody in the orchestra. That was the style of Robert Russell Bennett and Phil Lang. And if I haven't mentioned it earlier, Phil Lang was the one who said to me, Read the lyric before you start orchestrating. It will inform you as to what to write. Obvious, but it needs to be said, and you need to absorb that to be a writer. Uh, but the style was to write the melody in the orchestra. But in later days and in pop music, you tend to leave the melody out and write beautiful backgrounds. Well, Ralph was the one who said to me, sometimes you need to put some instrument on the melody just because it helps it along and it's the right thing to do, even if it's one clarinet. And then, of course, sometimes you get a performer who couldn't carry a tune in a basket, and you need to put the melody in the orchestra. But that was the style. So when you listen to shows like South Pacific, King and I, the melody is very often in the first violins, all the way through. That was the style. That was the way it was done. But Wilcox was capable of doing anything. We had Diana Rigg, uh, English actress, mostly known as Emma Peel in The Avengers when I was growing up, playing the lead. And Diana was more of an actress than a singer, but Larry very wisely didn't pad the melody uh, in the orchestra. He let her alone, and she was able to carry the ball by herself very often. Sometimes he helped it along on a ballad, but on the patter songs, he stayed out of the way. And he was very good using the woodwinds. And on the orchestra for Colette, I believe we had 3 French horns, 3 trombones, and 2 trumpets. And it amazed me, only 2 trumpets instead of the usual 3. But he was right; it needed more of the middle and bottom in the orchestra. It was a beautiful orchestration. Much later, Larry Moore did a recording with record producer Bruce Kimmel of Colette Collage, which is also a beautiful job on the score of Colette. It was way after the show had closed in its pre-Broadway tryout. Uh, and a very good job, but it was not any relation to the orchestrations that were done in the pit by Larry Wilcox. It was just a different approach, but very effective because the score was so good. As my career progressed and I started to do more stuff in Hollywood, I got much more familiar with the Hollywood orchestrators: Brad Decter, Jeff Majian, John Neufeld, uh, Mark McKenzie, tons of tons of guys who did this full time, and it was a whole different approach because in Hollywood you can have these gigantic orchestras, 50, 60, 70, with symphony-sized orchestras for almost any film. TV was less. You'd have an orchestra of 20 or 30 or sometimes 10, depends on the show and the music that was required. But I'm going to save all of that for a whole other podcast. And I hope you find this interesting. I find it interesting to reminisce and talk about these orchestrators that I learned so much from. And I hope you'll keep tuning into my podcast. Hope you enjoy. Thanks for listening.